thanks to all of you for being here today. For those of you who might not know me, I'm Fred's brother, Bill Foster, one of the founding fathers of ETC back when we were all teenagers. But I guess I'm the only one who shares 99.5% of Fred's DNA. Many of you, and probably most of you, remember Fred as the strong adult who led ETC in such a forward-thinking and such a moral way. I'd like to spend my time here telling you something about our childhood and the threads of our family that were woven together to make Fred's lives and mine what they were for our loved ones, our family, and for ETC. Fred Raymond Foster was named for Fred Raymond, our mother's father, who came from a long line of inventors. Our great-grandfather and great-uncle patented one of the windmill designs that spread across the prairies and invented the Raymond whirlwind separators for fine particulates in mining and manufacturing that is still being manufactured today. Our grandfather, Fred Raymond, who we all called Pop, invented the duostat, which he manufactured in downtown Chicago. That was a device that regulated building heat with input from multiple thermometers, combined with the logic of a single vacuum tube. So Fred and I inherited, both a basement full of really cool equipment and random parts left over from Pop's machine shop, and we also inherited the love of taking things apart and putting them back together in new and often dangerous configurations. And, of course, our mother, Jimmy Foster, who's Fred's son, James Foster, is named for, who taught us how to use a drill press, how to recanvas a canoe, and how to swear. On our father's side, there were leaders and men of action. A grandfather who led the civil construction for one of the cities in the desert built for the Manhattan Project, who led construction on one of the levels of Grand Central Station, and by the time he retired had directed construction projects in every one of the contiguous 48 states in the United States of America, and who, in his youth, sang the title role of the Mikado in a traveling theater production. And our father, Professor George W. Foster, the one-time dean of the law school at the University of Wisconsin, who was a scientist, who walked away from his career in science to become a civil rights lawyer, and ended up writing much of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the greatest steps forward for human rights in the history of our country. Dad knew Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and many of the heroes of the civil rights movement. He would describe to us having dinner in the kitchen of Merle and Medgar Evers and holding their infant child in his hands 6 weeks before Medgar Evers was shot down in his driveway. So if you ever wondered why it is that Fred always ran ETC in such an inventive and such a moral way, doing everything he could to stand up for every employee, at the same time expecting everyone to help make ETC a company that everyone could be proud of, then you don't have to look much farther than the values he was brought up with and the inherent goodness in Fred's soul. Now, most of our lives growing up were relatively normal, full of backyard football games, sledding, playhouses made of scrap plywood, flimsy go-karts, and so on. But also significant chemical experiments, fireworks, and much more advanced homemade pyrotechnics. I think at one point we had systematically violated pretty much every one of the Estes Model Rocket Code of Conduct items. You know what they are, right? You probably remember them. You shall not launch rockets indoors. You shall not launch rockets in a horizontal position. No explosive payloads. Don't launch small animals in your model rockets. The whole ball of wax. Now, Fred and I were 1.5 years apart, and much as it galled him, he was my little brother. And however, he always seemed to grow up faster. He was the first one to have a girlfriend, the first one to smoke and to drink, and to stop smoking and drinking, kind of. And for 1 or 2 terrifying years, it even looked like he was going to grow up taller than I was. And we ended up tied, so it's all fine. We both loved to race sailboats, and later in life, we both loved raising our kids. Fred always gravitated toward the performing arts, and I gravitated toward science and computers. Fred used to enjoy summarizing this by saying, you know, Fred is the one that talks, Bill is the one that thinks. And it certainly started out that way. You know, I was the programmer, Gary was the circuit designer, Jimmy was the jack of all trades, and Fred was the console design artist and the salesman. And of course, Susan became the one who kept Fred's head out of the clouds and focused on production schedules. But by the time that Fred's and my lives had crossed and crisscrossed again and again, it was Fred who was staying up late analyzing the next technological summit for ETC to conquer, while I just seemed to be wandering around and buffeted by the random winds of public opinion in the U.S. Congress. And our lives now seem to be intertwined forever with a common purpose: to make people's lives, your company, and our country a better place. And for those of you who work at ETC, I can tell you that Fred was always very, very proud of you. Thank you all.
While it's difficult to talk about him in the past tense, there is no doubt that Fred was a great man. And underpinning all the incredible things he did in his life was a wonderful sense of humanity, humor, and, well, he was just a lot of fun. At LDI, the year the Source 4 was introduced, Fred masterminding a complete toilet papering of the TNB booth early on the first day, something he conducted with great thoroughness, which I'm sure many people here can understand. Also, through the years at trade shows around the world, Fred would often, usually with some kind of financial encouragement, help market TNB by wearing various items of our swag. Fred's humanity was evident in many ways. Significant to those who knew him was how he managed to build what is probably the largest and most successful company in our industry in such a way that, regardless of its size, ETC everywhere retains a real sense of family. Sad as Fred's passing is, I hope that his family, his colleagues, and his friends can find solace in the thought that it's going to be very hard to ever think of him without raising a smile.
I've known Fred for about a decade. When I first met him, I really liked his fashion sense and wanted to mold myself in his image.
Hi, I'm James Bradley. I'm another of the original gangsters at ETC. And I have 3 Fred stories from the early time that I'd like to tell. The first is about innovation. There's a notion in business nowadays that's quite popular called best practices. And in some companies, best practices is used as an excuse to stop thinking. Oh, we're doing best practices, as if that's the best thing you could possibly do. And Fred understood intuitively, as you got from Bill, that even at 18 years old, long before he'd heard that term, that best practices is actually a good place to start thinking about how this could be better. And Fred took Bill to see the best practices in lighting control board design in 1975, and he didn't say to Bill, look at this is the best it could possibly be. He said, can't we make a better one? And so we set out to make a better one. And Fred understood that innovation was about trying things, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't work. And if they didn't work, maybe you got to learn something and try again. But he had inventing in his blood, as you heard from Bill, and he didn't have anything for best practices. And that's one of the things I admire about him. My second story is kind of about courage, what I would call blind, stupid courage. Because in some ways he was much braver than I was. And about halfway through building the prototype for the light board that kicked off this company, we were sitting in the back of the physics department where 3 of us had jobs, and we weren't doing much physics department work anymore, but we still had keys, which meant at night we could come in and use the oscilloscopes and the unlimited accounts on mainframe computers around the country and all the things the physics department had to offer. And in this way, really, ETC was yet another startup that was really founded with the unwitting help of a major university. Was I supposed to say that? So the thing, it was one of these projects where the first 90% of the project takes 90% of the time, and the last 10% of the project takes the other 90%. And we were maybe 90% done, so we thought, oh yeah, not too much left. And then Fred's friend Gilbert Hemsley, who is on the theater staff, and I think you'll hear more about Gilbert in some of the videos, was on the theater faculty, arranged for the first national simulcast opera to happen at the Union Theater in Madison. And for those of you under 40, a simulcast meant showing it on television and also playing it on FM radio at the same time, because the television audio signals at the time were so terrible that it didn't sound good if you just had the TV. So it was a pretty good solution, but the first time this had ever happened with an opera, and it was going to be broadcast nationally and live, was at the Union Theater. And Fred, being good friends with Gilbert, immediately got us signed up to have our prototype run the lights for this thing. Someone else like me might have had us sign up to run a local stage play or something to, see how it went. But that wasn't Fred. And we had 6 weeks now to actually do the last 10% of getting this thing working. And so we're kind of working around the clock a little bit frantically, and I'm pretty much terrified. And we did get it done, and we sort of, feeling a little smug, we carried everything over to the Union Theater, and we walked in, except it was 6 o'clock on dress rehearsal night. And as we walked in, all the sets were built, the lights were all hung, and people in huge costumes were running around the stage singing